Right now, with regards to the military landscape as it pertains to the Gaza Strip, there are two divisions of the Israel Defense Forces that are currently primed and ready to move into Rafah as soon as the approval of the Israeli government is given to the military operation there. Those two divisions are the 162nd Division and the 98th Division. The 162nd Division was operating inside central Gaza. That's an enormous, enormous division. The 98th Division was operating primarily of late inside Khan Yunis. The 98th Division is a storied division now in Israel. It is the commando division of the Israeli Defense Forces, and it is headed by a legendary battlefield commander by the name of Brigadier General Dan Goldfuss, who was formerly the deputy commander of the Israeli Navy Commandos. And those are the two divisions that are primed to move forward, as I said, but they're primed to move forward with a couple of distinctions and differences. The first one is that the 162nd Division has already evacuated about 1 million Gazans from Gaza City. So it has the experience of how to do that under its belt. And as you know, one of the main challenges of the IDF moving forward inside Rafah has been this constant concern about them being able to do so while avoiding undue civilian casualties by way of harm befalling those Gazans who were moved south towards the area of Rafah, who were previously located in the north of Israel, while the IDF, in the north of Gaza rather, while the IDF operated inside northern Gaza. Now, the 162nd Division has got experience moving populations, therefore, and there are some changes that it will make. For example, there will now be checkpoints that are erected as the Gazans who are in the area of Rafah are moved out of that area so that they're spared any harm befalling them. But in the past, when the 162nd Division moved civilians from Gaza City south, it did so without any checkpoints. And so you had Hamas moving among the civilian population, therefore surviving. Now there will be these checkpoints that are erected to check these civilians as they're moved from the area of fighting in Rafah to a safe zone inside the Gaza Strip adjacent to the coast there. And in that way, there will be an avoidance of the infiltration of Hamas fighters and ultimately the escape of Hamas fighters from the area. So there will probably be 2 weeks of the evacuation of the population around the area of Rafah. It's very important to note that that evacuation will precede any major operation inside of Rafah by the Israel Defense Forces. It's also important to note that the fact that the IDF has to move this 1.2 million strong members of Gaza, the Gazan population, that is a direct consequence of the humanity and the humanitarian creed of the Israel Defense Forces, because were Israel seeking to commit genocide, as people have falsely expressed it is doing, we would not have to deal with 1.2 million Gazans who have been displaced in order to keep them out of harm's way, immiserated, certainly, but immiserated because of the October 7th attack launched by Hamas against Israel. So it's going to be intense fighting in Rafah. This is not going to be small skirmishes. This will look like a war. It will feel like a war. It will very likely engage the air power of the Israeli Air Force. It certainly will engage the power and firepower of the Israeli artillery, and of course the Israeli infantry and the Israeli special forces. But it comes with a series of difficult dilemmas that may start to play out in real time, depending on how close to the Hamas leadership the IDF is able to come. For example, will the leadership of Hamas seek to stop that offensive by the IDF, perhaps by executing hostages? It's not something that people want to think about out loud, but it's something that absolutely has to be considered. And how will the Israel Defense Forces and the Israeli government respond if that does turn out to be the case? We've recently seen the release of surviving hostages inside the Gaza Strip on video. We've seen them released by Hamas for their propaganda aims. those have been very jarring to the Israeli home front, although I can tell you the overarching result of those videos has been not to deter Israel from moving forward inside the Gaza Strip, but rather to encourage the Israeli people behind the idea that our hostages are still alive and therefore must be rescued and released from the clutches of Hamas. So one of the reasons that you're seeing this feverish effort for a deal to be done, other than the obvious, is that this major operation by the Israel Defense Forces is going to be in the area of Rafah, which is the city that is adjacent to the Rafah crossing. The Rafah crossing, of course, abuts the Sinai Peninsula, which is sovereign Egyptian territory. Egypt has a very, very deep concern behind the idea that the Gazan population will be moved from the area of Rafah into the Sinai Peninsula, which is something that the Egyptians want to avoid. And as a consequence of that, they are now leveraging as much pressure as they're able to on Hamas in order to see the hostages released. Now, the stages of the hostage release are quite complex and very complicated. Israel, in a previous round, was seeking to have 40 hostages released. It's now reduced that number to 33. Hamas wants to see aerial surveillance stopped by the Israelis for 8 hours per day, 10 hours per day on days when hostages are released. But ultimately, what I think people need to realize and understand is that Sinwar wants one thing above all. He wants to see an end to the war. He will take such an outcome as a victory. He will propagandize it as a victory, falsely so. And he will express, by way of that, that jihadism has survived. It can survive any onslaught by any enemy, certainly any Western enemy, certainly the Zionist enemy, as he would term it. And without him receiving assurances that a release of the hostages will result in an end of hostilities, it's unlikely that we're going to see them released by way of a deal. Much more likely is that there will have to be some sort of military resolution to this crisis. What that resolution will look like precisely is unknown, obviously. There's one other point that is important for your viewers to note. Last week, Hamas actually said that they would bring about a cessation to hostilities from their side if that cessation was connected to the bringing about of a two-state solution. Now, I have always thought the two-state solution, as commonly understood, is a deleterious policy to the state of Israel. It's a nonsensical policy, stillborn and flawed at the point of conception, and really is something that should be consigned to the dustbin of history in terms of a policy position. Now, if anybody disagrees with that idea, they're welcome to do so, but keep in mind the following. If Hamas is endorsing the two-state solution, which it just did last week, everybody can be clear-eyed about the fact that the two-state solution would bring about the end of the state of Israel as we know it, hence Hamas's readiness to enter into such a bargain.